This is B.H. Beck from George Mason University, speaking on ammonia emissions.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you for having me in this conference. I used to be a monitoring person when I was in school. I did spend a fair amount of time on a monitoring location, especially in a hog farm and feedlot of beef industry, to capturing the ammonia emissions back in early 2000. And then I joined EPA, the UNC Chapel Hill, working with the EPA to develop the model that supports the photochemical model, people known as CMAC and CAMAX. So what some of you may not be familiar with what the emissions modeling is. Emissions modeling is practically those measured data you gather. US EPA has developed this official version of the bottom-up inventory data, which has a lot of uncertainty in there. And then there's a model like the one that I developed is actually processing it and converting the format that air quality model can understand. So it's a lot of work what's been going on for the last 17 years. It's been great. But the thing is, I've seen a lot of emission sources being updated and get better at it for the photochemical modeling work, while ammonia still hasn't gotten much of attention. So last year, 2 years ago, I started working directly with the OAQPS, develop ammonia emissions inventory data that led me into a little bit more uncertainty issues that I wanted to quantify and see whether we can improve that. Most of you know the ammonia, so I'm not going to go into bore you with the detail of the ammonia. Ammonium is the thing that we wanted to capture. But as emissions inventory that standpoint, we need to capture the quantity of the exact how much ammonia is actually introduced in the atmosphere, right? So there's a two approach. It's been gathered. But the most of the bottom-up inventory data is based on some of the process-based emissions inventory data developed by Carnegie Mellon University back in 2002. We've been using that since 2014. But then those are some data that we are looking at is quite interesting. So you see this area on the top right is emissions inventory data that currently used in US EPA. As you can imagine, see the Iowa is where the swine operation is significantly active, as well as North Carolina, where we're from, is really one of the hot spots. And then when you run the model with that inventory data, the model doesn't know what else other than what is given to them. So when you see the concentration line, you can see the hot spot of ammonia introduced in an emissions modeling system. However, when you look at the satellite data, ERC ammonia or CRIS ammonia data that some of you are familiar with, those are satellite data that we compiled over the years and looked at the data spatial pattern and temporal pattern. We are seeing quite a bit of different spatial distribution you're seeing here in the United States. In mid-US, with the lack of the representation of ammonia, while there's a lot of swine operation seems to be overestimated compared to beef industry. So this study is using CTM model called the photochemical model that EPA has used. But as some of you know, CMAC can be quite long time and difficult to run. It takes a lot of time to generate the output data that's accurate. It's great physical, chemical decay, reactions, and physics, all that included in there, but still takes a lot of time and effort in there. So what we have done is me and my postdoc has been working on developing this new model called Deep CTM. It's based on the neural network model that can be run once it's trained well, then it can run pretty quickly within a few minutes. You can actually get the result compared to half an hour or few weeks for the entire year run. We can get it done within a day. And then you can see the many different scenarios run pretty quickly with a pretty good accuracy of the result. With that, also, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but I don't want to bore you with that. So we mimic what CTM is doing. So the one you see here is a CTM. You use input emissions and meteorology data in high resolution. Grease cell in hourly value goes in and CTM model and estimate the concentration. So this model of this CTM we're talking about is practically the mimic it. We don't really do anything new. It's practically copying what it does. And then what this study is focusing on is what Decoder does. We call it Decoder as well, but it's not the main focus of the study. So my next step of the study, once the model is trained well, the focus is bring the concentration that we may have, which is satellite data, some of the MMON data set. We gather those information, feedback into the model to calculate the emissions instead of just concentration. Why is it important? You can actually see the satellite image of ammonia. Ammonia is less reactive when it comes to the spot. However, that chemical decay in dry deposition that John Walker earlier presented, there's a significant amount of dry deposition and chemical decays there. It's not really represented in simple image inverse method. This one is actually consider what CTM is doing, and we reverse back into how we can compute that. So this is one of the simple snapshot of the 1 day of the 1 month of the June of the 2020. We just compared what deep CTM does versus CMAT. So each hourly data, which little dot is hourly value, we get this is like a really limited data set we have and train the models is 0.8. But however, when we train this model with NO2, we get 0.9 R² value, which is pretty good to be relying on what it does. So this model is practically understand emissions and meteorology, how they react and compute the concentration, what CTMS does. So with that, because the model is also pretty quickly can run, all the input data that I briefly mentioned here, you see the input data we put in is meteorology data. We put almost 11 different meteorology input data by degree cell by hour. And then we put some initial like geographic location, like a territorial height, other information, as well as the initial condition of the ammonia that help us to understand. And then emissions input data goes into the model to be trained. Once the model is well trained, you can actually perturbate them around by simply reducing each component by 20% or some temperature a little bit temperature reduction. When you compile them all together throughout the entire year run, and then you can composite all the result, what does give it to you is hourly of each degree cell, we know which component of the meteorology or emissions is contributing to the ammonia concentration in that sense. So CMAC also can do that, but it just takes a lot of time and effort. But this one takes a lot less time to look into and retrieve the data set that we are looking for. So briefly mentioned earlier, once the decoder is trained well, then now we're going into this, we call it encoder. It's a variational autoencoder. It's very well known in machine learning world. We use that information to knowledge that we got from the decoder, we are applying back. So what you're seeing here in this decoder is a deep CTM that I mentioned, coming from the emissions, get the concentration. And also, once the information has been passed on to called encoder, it takes this data set called satellite retrieval data set that we used from our collaborator from Canada. So that data gets put into encoder and they get the emissions data set. And then we can compare them to see how much of the emissions is underestimated and overestimated based on actual measurement of the ammonia that consider the physically and chemically information. So now, going into satellite is what some of you have experienced. I'm not an expert satellite, but I've been working with the Canadian folks who developed this algorithm from the CRIS, fast physical retrieval. It does come with a profile concentration. For this study, because we are interested in ammonia in the surface, we are using the layer 1 surface concentration that this model has been developed, this satellite retrieval. Has been validated, this algorithm has been validated with ammonia measurement data from MMON, and you see that some of the little bit overestimating what they have found, but our coefficient is 0.8. So we believe this quality data set is good enough for us to move forward. And also this model has been tested on an actual spot. The ammonia sources like Capo is very easy to identify because it's a remote location. You can see the hot spot on it, and then you can actually validate the satellite image with that data set. So the idea is using this CRIS data set, it's 2013 to 2015, you can see winter time is definitely less, but then you see the huge spike comes in the mid-US where cattle industry is quite significantly active. But while we are seeing as ammonia, that I mentioned to you earlier, we don't see a lot of hot spot on Iowa and North Carolina as much as what we are seeing here. So this data set, there are 2 instruments from the 2 different satellites. We gather those, and then we use as more data point force combined and then use interpolate to create a surface concentration. So this model requires every degree cell concentration is needed to back calculate. So that's one of the caveats. So if you don't have a good concentration to feed into the encoder, the worst data set you're going to get. So this is a 2017 NEI data set that you see in the agriculture sector. It's currently available. You can see the dairy section has ammonia emissions on the left-hand side. There's some Iowa, you can definitely see the hot spot. And then the North Carolina, there's a little hot spot. In the mid-US, the North Panhandle area in Texas wasn't really much. There's some, Colorado has emissions coming from there. But this image, as I mentioned to you earlier, it talks otherwise. So where the emission source is, so I break down into detail emission-specific source inventory data and looking at this in beef and swine operation. As you can see, beef looks to be underrepresented. It's in the same scale. So you can see beef seems to be underestimated compared to swine operation. So is that true? And we include all the fertilizer emissions together to create this composite emissions inventory that compare with the satellite-driven emissions data. So the one on the left-hand side, the NEI inventory data was used as an input to run CMAQ. And you can see the hourly data, but because of where the emissions are, you can see the hot spot is in Iowa, North Carolina, dairy industry, California is one of the hot spots. However, the one on the right, in the satellite-driven, we see a big spike of the emissions, other spaces more in the Panhandle, California, of course. BAE is what I mentioned to you, variational autoencoder is used. So what it happened was the one on the right-hand side of the emissions, the concentration data we developed will be used as an input and generate the top-down emissions data will be generated. And then while that information will feed back into decoder to do the forecasting, the forecasting of the concentration. So a BAE, a simulated meaning the concentration was driven by the top-down data from the satellite. As you can see, I just talked to Brad earlier, NEI ammonia seems to be overall totally underestimated. As you can see, satellite speaks a lot more higher, and this red is what my model, the DeepCTM, is generating based on the satellite, so it should be more closer to it. But however, one NEI seems to be isolated in very spot that really strong, but it's not really well represented spatially and temporally. It speaks a little bit more bigger value when you look at the regional standpoint. If you look at the west, southwest, and Great Plains, the blue is a CMAQ estimated ammonia concentration, while red is a satellite driven. You can see it well correlated in some area, while other areas not. I think the one of the interesting is this here is ammonia during the northeast and southeast, where the humidity is play a role, as well as a lot of rain season. So we normally put, using temporal profile to annual total inventory data, put in a monthly value into the model. That's why you see the same, almost similar pattern in the northeast and southeastern region, always high. So it looks like we're overestimating some of the ammonia in the hot season where we know it's higher. But then during the rainy season, sometimes the meteorology significant impact ammonia in a particular 2019, we see otherwise. So do you want to see on the left-hand side what you're seeing when I showing the prior emissions inventory data? The one on the right is the posterior emissions data. You can see the quite different pattern over there. So we even further do the model to be do the better job. So when you look at the emission total, you don't know which one is actually the most contributing to uncertainty. So we looked into more animal specific by the reason. So the model was able to capture which animal sector is actually contributing the most to the uncertainty by time and space. By doing so, as I mentioned in the southern region, swine operation, entire average over the entire country, we are seeing swine emissions is underestimated during those hot, warmer season compared to the emissions used in the CMAQ. And when you compare to the result of the concentration of the top-down emissions inventory data, we definitely see the higher overestimated CMAQ in ammonia from Iowa and North Carolina, and some of the underrepresentation of the north in the Panhandle region. And also beef cattle, you can see the clearly meat sector of the area where the beef industry is significant, ammonia has been totally underestimated. So what it means, how are we going to use this information to improve the NEI? So I've been working with the EPA with using this model called farm emissions model. a semi-empirical bottom-up inventory data tool that takes very detailed, the meteorology information, daily meteorology information, and farm management practice, meaning each region has a different way of doing swine, the way the housing, the way the storaging and applications are different by the region. Using that information, and also there's a parameter like a nitrogen intake, urine concentrations, and many other, there's about 35 different variables is involved in this model that we need to tune the model. So we developed 2020 NEI, still we see significant issues of the meteorology impact has been represented a little bit better, but it's still underrepresented. So we need to look into updating this input data that drives this model to represent spatial and temporary. So we believe this model seems to working well. So another good benefit of this model development is what I'm interested in using, applying in a different country where there's not good emissions bottom-up inventory that is met. It's not just for the ammonia, NO2 and SO2 and AOD, like PM2.5, where there's no good bottom-up inventories that developed, not unlike United States. This can be used as constrained emissions, top-down constrained emissions, help them to guide where is a lack of the emissions data is causing a problem. So we believe this tool has been doing well, and we're looking forward to working with many other collaborators. And that's it. So if you have any question, please let me know. Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Thanks. Sorry. This was a really great talk. I was wondering, you mentioned that Chris is a little bit higher than Amon, and I was wondering if you've considered if there could be a role for systematic spatial biases in the satellite products, for example, if there could be cloud cover, related to the spatial distribution of some of the sectors that you're looking at. I imagine you've looked at this, and so I guess I'm just curious about it.
Thanks for the great question. As I mentioned to you, this encoder is totally driven by the input of the satellite data set. So it is important to get the right data. I'm not really the person who developed this retrieval, so I can't really give you an accurate answer to that. What I remember was that there's a lot of cloud interference, and we have to remove it. The reason we bring two different, 1 year we have a 2-instrument data set was available. So we brought it together to introduce more data set to be a spatial coverage. I can't really answer to why it's like slope is a little bit higher and a lower, like a higher than 15% of the concentration. I will have to ask the other person who worked on it. So thank you. Sorry. Brett?
So, first, I believe you. I'm on your side. The emissions are probably underestimated. But I wonder, how can we be sure? How do you know? Because you could change the deposition velocities, for example, to adjust your match to the concentrations. So is there a way that you can use your model to evaluate both the emissions and the deposition?
Correct. So great question. As he mentioned, CMAC is what it does. So I did not change what the dry deposition used in the CTM model. So we use what has been given. Speaking of that, so because of that, we may overestimating or underestimating, I think underestimating because of higher dry deposition by the season. John mentioned earlier about the seasonality of the dry deposition could play a role because what this model does is mimicking the model. So if we look at the data set, it doesn't really capture the significantly underestimated. We need to look back into the model of the CMAC to look into whether tune the model, regenerate input data, and run the model of this machine learning model to reflect those changes appropriately.
Thank you. That was a great talk. I guess, and maybe I misunderstood what you were showing for your emissions inventories, but it looked like the neural network you developed led to a more diffuse pattern in where your emissions were kind of occurring than what the model suggested. Would you read this as potentially being, that your current inventories aren't capturing those diffuse inventories quite as well, or is it an artifact of how the model is designed?
What was the first question about your CTM model you think that?
So like here, yeah, so this as well as the the neural network you used, the emissions look more diffuse.
Right.
Is that what you would expect as maybe we're misrepresenting diffuse sources, or is it something that's just inherently due to the smoothing of the way the model is designed?
Right. So yes, this model has no AI as what we are thinking. It only does what it does, what the CMAC is currently trained with. So CMAC is a model, the computer model, based on totally driven by the input data. So as long as we give them the wrong spatially and temporally inappropriate emissions data introduced, it will do what it does. So that's why we are seeing a CMAC cannot do anything, and hoping this model give us this data set is not fixing the issues. I think this data set is actually giving us the guidance, where the uncertainties are. And this model clearly speaks, there's some underrepresentation of the beef industry that we need to look into. So this is more confined, use it as a proxy for us to improve the bottom of inventory. I don't necessarily.
This is Lillian Namey from Colorado State talking about contributions of ammonia dry deposition to, I can't read it all from this angle.
Rocky Mountain National Park. Can you all hear me all right from where that is? Yes? Okay, great. So I'm going to continue talking about ammonia, but maybe get at a little bit of Brett's question about the deposition of ammonia. But specifically, I'm just going to be looking at Rocky Mountain National Park, so a little bit of a narrower spatial view than the last talk. And kind of the big question that I'm going to talk about today, and I'll come back to this later, is this idea of how good is good enough. So how does the data time resolution really impact our annual ammonia dry deposition, so our annual input of ammonia into the ecosystem at Rocky Mountain National Park? I'll come back to this and explain it in a little more detail later on. But to orient us in this much smaller region than the last talk, talking about the whole continental US, we're in Northeast Colorado. That green is Rocky Mountain National Park. Our measurement site is on the far east side of the park. And there was some great setup about ammonia emissions from cattle. And what we see in this region of Northeast Colorado is that we have pretty heavy agricultural activity, large ammonia emissions. When we think about how that ammonia is getting up into the national park, there's some important topography to understand. So the Colorado Plains are at about 5,000 feet. Our monitoring site is about 9,000 feet. And what we're seeing is transport up into Rocky Mountain National Park through a mountain plains circulation that's bringing those polluted air masses to the west and up into the park. We can see that in just some simple windrows plots for ammonia. Here I've just separated out the daytime and the nighttime windroses, looking at that direction and then also the ammonia concentration. And so what we see is that during the day, we have sort of two sectors of transport, west to north, which I'll call downslope, and south to east, which I'll call upslope. That upslope fraction really represents transport from those eastern plains. It's not due east because of some local channeling. And then overnight, we really see predominant downslope flows. And what we can also see in the daytime is that some of those highest ammonia concentration values are really brought to the park by that upslope flow. So thinking about reactive nitrogen deposition in Rocky Mountain National Park, this is a historical problem for Rocky Mountain. This is some data from a paper in 2013 that looked at the speciated wet and dry deposition in Rocky Mountain. Here I'm going to really focus on that dry deposition of ammonia, colored red here for a non-routine measurement. And the way it was estimated in this paper is using a correction factor to the deposition velocity of nitric acid and assuming only a unidirectional, just to the surface deposition. So when we think about that previous paper, it uses this unidirectional deposition framework, right, where we have ammonia just depositing onto the surface, again, scaling the deposition velocity of nitric acid, because at the time that was provided through the CastNet data. But what we actually know about ammonia is that it can be deposited or emitted from the surface, and to understand that, we really need a bidirectional model. I'm showing an example of a bidirectional model here, the Masad et al. There are a couple of others. This is the one that I'm going to focus on for this talk as we kind of dig more deeply in. Some important things to understand about this is that we use these resistances to calculate compensation points. Based on the relationship between those compensation points and the atmospheric concentration, we either see deposition or emission. So when the atmospheric concentration exceeds the compensation point, we have deposition, vice versa, we have emission. So talking about these direct measurements that we made at Rocky Mountain, we were fortunate enough to be on a neon tower and actually take some direct flux measurements using a concentration gradient with URG denudor filter pack sampling trains. I'm not going to talk too much today about those direct flux measurements, but keep an eye out for some other work on that. And then we also have radiolopassive measurements at tower top for a full year of data. We have micrometeorology at a 30-minute time interval from NEON, which will be really important for this work. And then at a nearby site, we have an AMON passive, and we have a high time resolution ammonia measurement from the Air Sentry, which I'm going to lean pretty heavily on for this analysis. So this is a pretty unique data set because we have high time resolution micrometeorology, we have high time resolution ammonia, and we also have this passive data that we can directly compare it to. So now we're kind of back to that how good is good enough, right? And trying to understand, we'd really love to be able to use just the passive data, but because we know that ammonia concentration and these compensation points both have a diel pattern, does just using the biweekly average still capture deposition on this annual time scale? And as we think about this in terms of the models, why do these have a diel pattern? We really take in those micrometeorological parameters from NEON again. And for the deposition only, we're just using a few parameters, but for this bidirectional exchange, we have more micromet parameters that have their own associated diel pattern. And then we're also using literature values for emission potentials and some other atmospheric concentrations. So to give you kind of a conceptual understanding of what these compensation points and ammonia concentrations look like for a diel pattern, first we can look at that canopy compensation point that I'm modeling using the Mossad et al. We see that it peaks during the daytime, and when we look to that middle plot, ammonia concentration also peaks during the daytime. This is in part due to that upslope flow happening during the day, bringing higher concentrations up into the park. And then when we just look at the difference between these two, so just to give you an understanding of if we would see deposition or emission, the negative values deposition, positive values emission, that's going to be the same for the rest of the talk also. So when the ammonia concentration exceeds the canopy compensation point, where we have these negative values, that's where we're seeing the largest deposition amounts, so during the daytime. So why don't we just take lots of high time resolution data? I'm sure I don't need to tell you all that high time resolution data is time intensive and quite expensive to do. We already have the AMON network, which has the biweekly passive. We have some of these other data sets that we'd love to be able to use if they're representative for the deposition. So for this talk, I'm really sort of in two different categories. We have this unidirectional, which is sort of going to take into account what we've historically done in the past. And then we have these 4 different bidirectional methods where I'm going to compare different time resolutions of data, ranging from this pair of biweekly ammonia and monthly micrometeorology averages compared with 30-minute time resolution of both. So for these 3 ammonia data products, we have, again, 30-minute time resolution. Then I've also done an annual deal adjustment, and we have a biweekly concentration. So we're going to walk through these together. I've just zoomed in over about a 5-week period so that you can see the relative differences better. So for this biweekly ammonia, this is that passive measurement. It's the same value across the 2 weeks because it's an integrated biweekly sample. For the annual deal adjustment, I've taken that higher time resolution Air Sentry data, which allows us to adjust for a diel pattern. And then for this 30-minute ammonia, I've taken that Air Sentry data and adjusted it based on the biweekly. Important to note here that the mean across a 2-week period for all of these data products is the same. So now we kind of get to the meat of it. What does annual ammonia dry deposition look like in Rocky Mountain National Park when we compare these different methods? In gray, we have the unidirectional. In blue, we have the bidirectional. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that the largest predicted ammonia deposition is that unidirectional model by a quite significant factor. But now as we kind of dig into these bidirectional models, first with that highest time resolution data, which we think should be capturing both the deposition and emission the best, we see that it's much larger than the annual deal adjustment. We lose about 50% of the deposition when we go to an annual deal, even paired with a high time resolution micrometeorological data set. And between the biweekly ammonia and the annual deal adjustment, we see a pretty negligible change. This was quite surprising to me. I thought that the annual deal adjustment would sort of bias more towards that high time resolution data set. And then the other thing I want to call your attention to is that we have this monthly micrometeorological data taken from the Neon Tower as an average, but perhaps a good proxy for a reanalysis product or a sort of climatological understanding of these MET parameters. And it actually agrees quite well with the 30-minute ammonia and the 30-minute micromet. So when we ask this question of, is it necessarily worse to decrease our data time resolution, it looks like for Rocky Mountain National Park for this year, perhaps not. And this has been quite surprising to me, but I'm also sort of cautiously optimistic about, as we sort of dig into it more, what it might say about the validity of using biweekly ammonia and lower time resolution MET data in order to capture bidirectional exchange of ammonia in Rocky Mountain National Park. So we can also look at the variability in these ammonia fluxes, sort of as we would expect. The highest time resolution data, that top box plot, has the most variability in both deposition and emission. As we decrease time resolution moving down, we have less variability in those values. And here that orange line's the median, red star is the mean. So we see that kind of annual deposition plot that we just saw play out again here in those mean values. So then the kind of last thing that I want to draw your attention to is just the way that we also see seasonal changes in flux values. So if we look at that bottom left corner, the summertime, we have the largest flux values for any season, and they're also peaking during the daytime. That's sort of closely followed by fall and spring, and then quite small fluxes over the wintertime. This is in part important because with further data analysis, we'll have seasonally resolved data from soil and vegetation, which should help parameterize these seasonal differences. So with that, just my two things I'd like to leave you with is that over that full year of ammonia data in Rocky Mountain, that biweekly and monthly MET generates a pretty similar total ammonia dry deposition as the high time resolution data. And then I also urge you to keep an eye out for a paper from Da Pan, which is going to use those direct flux measurements and better parameterize these bidirectional exchange models for a forest ecosystem, which is lacking in the literature. Thank you.
Who's up first? Any questions?
Thank you for the great talk. Just quick question is the bi-weekly ammonia with the 30-minute MET with the monthly MET. What is the amount of the dry deposition seems to be very close. What is the main driver? Like the surface roughness issues? What is the driving this increase of the biweekly with the low quality of the meteorology data?
So between when we are just using the monthly MET versus the 30-minute MET paired with the biweekly, yeah. This is a good question. I'm still trying to really figure it out and looking sort of directly at the resistances and compensation points. As of yet, it seems that when we move to monthly, these sort of biases correct for each other as we see kind of higher things in one way and lower things in the other direction. But It's a great question of, are we getting it right for the right reason? And from this, we have no idea. So I'm really trying to dig into that to better understand what is driving it. And it's hard to say right now.
Really interesting, Lily. Thanks for sharing the results. One question I had is, in the plot where you showed the annual fluxes, did you take the average flux and then just scale it up to annual, or did you add up all of the fluxes to get to that number? And I'm curious how that cumulative flux differs from the average or median flux across those different methods.
Yeah, that's a good question. For the deposition, these are summed
Okay.
across the year. But when we look at the mean values through those red stars, I'd have to dig a little bit more into, like across a year for kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, how that deposition changes, taking the mean value instead of summing them. But this, at least shape of the means, indicates to me that it would be relatively similar.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm wondering what the distribution of your 30-minute concentrations has to do relative to this difference between approaches as you aggregate up points to get to the annual scale. So are these high 30-minute concentrations, making a large contribution to that cumulative flux as you add it up? But we can talk more about it later. This is really interesting to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll tug on Superman's cape a little. Have you considered the cost estimation so that when you are comparing the data quality or the outcome, you can also look at the how much it costs part?
I haven't. That's a great question. Yeah, I'm not sure what the operating cost of the Air Sentry is. And I'm also not sure, like the Neon micromet tower, I'm sure is an astronomical cost compared to a modeled reanalysis product. So yeah, that'd be interesting to take a look at.
And next up, we have Colleen Boblitz with US EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Is that what you're representing now, or is this previous
This
work?
is ORD.
Okay.
But that's,
More on ammonia.
that's right. Cool. Okay, so yeah. So thanks so much for having me. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks, John, for coordinating this session. I'm presenting work on behalf of a group of co-authors. So this is from my postdoc, where I was mentored by John Walker and Jesse Bash in the Office of Research, and in collaboration with Jiyoung, who preceded me as a postdoc. So here we're trying to develop an inferential model for dry deposition across the Ammonia Monitoring Network, or AMON. Okay, here's our disclaimer. Okay, so motivating this work, I think folks here will be well familiar, but ammonia is a large and growing contributor to total nitrogen deposition. Here on the left, we can see a plot showing the ammonium contribution to total nitrogen. In the early 90s, we can see it was a minority contributor in much of the country, but in more recent years, 2010 to 2012, it has grown to be most of the total nitrogen deposited in most of the country. So much of the ammonia is lost through dry deposition, which is challenging to measure, such that there are few long-term observations of this process. And so our way at getting at trying to learn a little bit more about it is to use an inferential model. In this case, we're using the surface-tiled aerosol and gaseous exchange model, or STAGE, which is a dry deposition option in EPA's CMAQ model. So models like STAGE represent deposition analogous to an electrical circuit, which Lily did a really great job of introducing in her talk. So here you can see fluxes to various pathways represented either in parallel or in series. So in this case, we have soil and plant, leaf, cuticle, and stomatal pathways. Mentioning also, as Lily very nicely introduced, that ammonia's dry deposition is bidirectional, and whether it deposits or is emitted is based on a compensation point. So here we're trying to create a new framework for inferential modeling of dry deposition, and we've made an effort to use observations and publicly available data sets to the extent possible in order to run stage offline from CMAC. And so I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I've listed, the meteorology, plant, and soil data sets that we've compiled, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it, though. And there are a few parameters that either aren't available through reanalysis or public observation-based products that we attempt to estimate offline, and we've evaluated that using some pilot site observations, which I'll show in a few slides. So from these inputs, we develop estimates of ammonia net and component fluxes for each of the AMON sites using stage. So just to sort of draw the analogy to a product that I think folks here will be well familiar with, an AMON-wide inferential model, we hope might follow in the legacy of the multi-layer model that's been employed across CASNet. Okay, and so just moving into describe some evaluation we've done so far. There are some really nice pilot site measurements available for Chiricahua and Bonneville. Just to get you oriented to what these sites look like, Chiricahua is a complex topography grassland in southern Arizona, and Bonneville is relatively flat farmland in Illinois. Okay, and so I have some evaluation of the meteorological parameters measured at these sites for 2018. And I don't expect folks to remember everything here necessarily, but I'm just going to highlight a few things that I think might be influential in terms of our ultimate results. So we're seeing that there's some fairly substantial biases for wind speed and for soil moisture. And as I mentioned, part of the motivation with this project is to make a product that might be relatively easily implemented. And so we're using what I think are the most reasonable products from that perspective. But if folks have any interest or any suggestions for other things that might be available for this, I'd be really interested. But in the meantime, we're using what we have, and we're going to have some sensitivity simulations that will try to pull apart what the effect of these biases might be. Then for friction velocity and for wetness, for friction velocity, we have an offline calculation that we could attempt to tune to our site, which may be hazardous in its own way because we just have this one site that's showing these biases. But perhaps there's some progress to be made there as well. For wetness, my understanding of wetness parameterizations is that they're fairly uncertain, and I think even though our performance is not really outstanding necessarily, it is within the range of what could be considered reasonable for wetness for this application. Okay, so with that in mind, we move forward to look at an evaluation of on like a process basis relevant for our deposition model. So here I'm showing the model it's not the model, it's the input to the model in red, and the pilot site observations in black. On the left is Bonneville, and on the right is Chiricahua. And so I'm going to show on this slide aerodynamic conductances, which is the top row, as well as the quasi-laminar boundary layer conductances, which have been calculated, either using those two data sets. Okay, and so for the aerodynamic conductances, the terms that influence it are wind speed and friction velocity, and for the boundary layer resistances, friction velocity and air temperature are the deciding factors. So we can see from this that the wind speed bias I had shown on the prior slide, at least for Bonneville, affects the aerodynamic but not boundary layer conductance. We see the wind speed doesn't necessarily feed into biases all the way through to the boundary layer. But in the case of Chiricahua, where we saw those friction velocity biases that I had highlighted, we can see biases in both the aerodynamic and quasi-laminar boundary layer conductances at Chiricahua. So this is just sort of an example of how we're moving forward with evaluating the inputs to our model. But we would like to apply this model to try to learn a little bit more about ammonia dry deposition across the US. And so some guiding questions we have for this work are what is this model telling us about how ammonia dry deposition varies over the US, which processes are modulating it, and what observations would be most useful for constraining the model representation of ammonia dry deposition. So first, looking at spatial variability in this process, here I'm showing annual average net ammonia fluxes across the United States, again, over the AMON network. And so we can see using negative values to represent depositional fluxes rather than emissive fluxes. We see that sites almost always, at least on an annual average basis, deposit on net. And I'm just going to highlight the ones that have the largest signal and try to take a closer look at those. So we see that some sites, in particular sites that have sort of shorter plant categories like crops or grasses, tend to contribute large fluxes if they're associated with high ammonia concentrations. On the other hand, deciduous broadleaf forests seem to be an outsized sink, and so these forests have a really large depositional signal, even though the ammonia concentration is not necessarily ranked highly relative to the full network. Okay, and I'm going to look at that land cover element a little bit closer in this slide. And so we can see that that takeaway related to deciduous forests extends more broadly to forested categories. It seems that forests contribute more deposition than other land cover categories relative to their proportional area. And so on the left here, I'm showing the distribution by area of the land cover categories sampled by AMON in 2018 at least. Okay, and on the right, I'm showing the monthly net depositional fluxes stacked across those land cover categories. So I realize there's a lot of information on this slide as well. Really, I think the main takeaway we can see in the land cover distribution that while this deciduous broadleaf forest jumps out as one of the main categories, it's a much smaller contributor to land cover by area in comparison to these shorter categories like crops, savannas, and grasses. And so we can see on the right-hand side that doesn't necessarily manifest in having a smaller contribution to depositional fluxes, and that light green color representing those deciduous broadleaf forests is a really large contributor, especially we see in the summertime when there's greening and high leaf area index. Okay, and so overall we see that forests by land area cover about 22%, non-forested areas are 78%, but that being said, forests contribute roughly half of the deposition across AMON. Okay, but if we look at it that way, we're missing part of the value of using a bidirectional model. So I just want to highlight that if you look only at the net fluxes, you're missing some of the interesting information that's going on behind the scenes in terms of the evasive fluxes that are happening among the non-forested land cover types. So I'm just going to orient you to the slide really quick. Okay, so I'm going to represent upward or emissive fluxes using warmer colors, and net downward or depositional fluxes using cool colors. And I'm going to look at this for the different pathways that contribute to deposition. So we see generally that stomatal fluxes are upward or emissive, whereas on the other hand, soil and cuticular fluxes tend to be downward. The pie charts are not quite to scale, but I just want to mention that cuticular fluxes are generally in magnitude much larger than either the stomatal or soil fluxes. They're about 6 times the size of either of the other two pathways. And so returning back to our discussion of the land cover contribution, we can see a really big piece of the pie in the cuticular pathway for deciduous broadleaf forests. So we can see essentially that the impact of the forested type comes through their contribution through the cuticular pathway. Grasslands also we find to be net downward in general. And this is in contrast to savannas and to crops, where we see that while they have a downward depositional signal, there is a strong offset through evasive stomatal fluxes. So it's worthwhile to take a closer look at the breakdown to see, sort of what's happening to offset those net fluxes that have been shown in the earlier slides. Okay, and so taking a closer look now at trying to use this model to parse a little bit more which specific processes are modulating ammonia dry deposition. We conduct some sensitivity simulations where we perturb individual input parameters and see the effect that that has on our ultimate estimate of ammonia fluxes. So just briefly to introduce the factors that we test that contribute to each of these pathways. For soil, it's pH, air temperature, friction velocity, and soil moisture. For the cuticular and stomatal pathways, they're both affected by air temperature, soil temperature, and relative humidity. The cuticular pathway is also affected by this empirical parameter from the literature that's known as alpha cuticular, which relates those fluxes to relative humidity. By land cover, I should say. And for stomatal fluxes, they're also affected by shortwave radiation, friction velocity, and soil moisture. The way that we implement these sensitivity simulations is we look at the observed diurnal profile at that site and take the standard deviation specific to that site, season, and hour. And develop essentially an envelope that we implement as the sensitivity case. And so we do that, thanks. We do that for the meteorology inputs that are shown on the right-hand side. We also test the sensitivity of a couple of other parameters that are implemented a little bit differently for soil pH and for the empirical alpha cuticular value that are essentially based on either a reasonable range of the variability for soil pH as well as literature values for the alpha cuticular parameter. Okay, and so just showing a summary of the sensitivity simulation results here. On the left, I'm showing the daily average flux across all sites and land cover categories through 2018. On the right, I'm pulling out the sensitivity simulations that made the largest difference. And so we found that to be friction velocity, the alpha cuticular factor, and relative humidity. And so I'm showing the difference as an absolute % difference just to make this a little bit easier to interpret given the downward direction of some of the fluxes sometimes. And you can see either the high or low sensitivity case shown through the line style. We see that friction velocity affects all but the cuticular resistances and also has sharp day-to-day variations. So if you recall, part of our setup for these sensitivity simulations is that we're looking at the observed variability of that parameter. And so if that parameter varies more, it could be the case that that's playing out in terms of the impact on the sensitivity simulations. Okay, I think I talked really quickly. Sorry. This was so much faster than I practiced, but so sorry about that. But I'm happy if anyone has questions or anything was unclear, I'd be happy to chat about it. But broadly, just to summarize, we have developed a new inferential modeling framework for a field scale dry deposition across AMON. Initial results suggest that uncertainty in inputs for wind speed have the largest effect on simulated fluxes. You may recall in the beginning that, that there were biases associated with wind speed and friction velocity, given that we see that those are influential in terms of our sensitivity simulations. That may be something we're thinking about more. This part of the presentation I truthfully didn't show here, which I know is a bad presentation practice, but we also have done some behind the scenes work looking at high pH soil sorption curves, which seem to be quite influential in those resistances and are pretty uncertain. What we're hoping this framework could be used for is to characterize uncertainty to help inform measurement strategies and possibly to offer an independent data set for comparison with the total deposition or TDEP maps. Okay, thanks.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Nice talk. I like this. It's good to see this advancing and seeing these kind of national assessments. When you compare this with the TDEP maps and you get a sense of where the alignment is, do you think you can use that to help identify future priority sites for AMON, like where we might where conditions like are necessary for the most important measurement areas.
Yeah, I think that would be an awesome application of this for sure. I think it's also interesting to think about prospects for incorporating this sort of framework with some of the satellite data sets that have been described here, and perhaps looking at where there's a large discrepancy either between, between possibly the model and what the satellite is showing could be a nice application. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you have any thoughts on places you'd like to look at, I'd be very interested in that too.
If you have money for us to look at, I'm happily.
Since you have time, maybe you can say a little bit more about the high pH soil, like what the influence is and where does that become important?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Jeff. Yeah, so you may recall that last year I presented a very similar talk on this project, and we showed pretty different results, in particular for high pH grasses and shrubs. And so what we had found was that, there are some parameters related to the soil absorption curves that needed to be adjusted to better reflect the soil ammonium dynamics for those, in particular, those land cover categories and at high pH values. And so John, did some really nice work at their USDA field site out in Idaho to try to develop more appropriate absorption curves and parameters to be able to be used in this work. And so that's what we're pulling from here. And he has a nice manuscript that I think is about to be submitted. It's super close, yeah. That should, discuss that work as well. Mm-hmm.
And can you say a little bit more about which of these sites that would influence?
Yeah, sure. Okay, let me think. Oh, I guess this is probably the best. So it's a little bit hard to see on this plot, but it was, definitely, near your turf, Jeff. Out west, I recall, the Utah sites were always jumped out, some sites in Wyoming, sites where there's high, where I'm not sure what more, high pH and grasses or shrubs. And so what we wound up finding was really sort of unreasonably large evasive fluxes, and in particular in the summertime, if I recall correctly. And so we had compared those fluxes against, NTN measured wet deposition to see if the magnitude could be reasonable, and it was like well outside the scope of what a reasonable value would be. So I think, I don't know to what, I'm very much a modeler, as you know, in my background, but, I'd love to hear folks' thoughts on the extent to which, it's possible to better characterize these soil parameters in like a more robust way for implementation of these sort of models. Oh, but it could be worth mentioning that, to my knowledge, this sort of dynamic is not well captured by regional models like CMAC, right? And so that's something that, I think atmospheric chemists, should think a little bit more about how to incorporate.
Thanks, Colleen.
So Jeff, to your point, this seems to be, it's most important in the high pH soils, but also in soils that are patchy and bare. So in places with high pH where there's not overlying vegetation, that's where we seem to be seeing the biggest problems in terms of taking the models that have been previously used for soils in the east and trying to run those frameworks in the west. So we're seeing we really have to, as Colleen said, look more closely at the absorption characteristics of the western soils. But yeah, that's a combination of things.
And now is Brett Schechtel with the National Park Service on more on deposition velocities.
Very well done on my name. You guys, we just heard 3 great talks, and even more this morning. They were very uplifting information. We're moving forward. I'm going to change the mood and bring it down. I'm going to be a bit of a downer here, but that brings opportunities. So what I really want to talk about is some work that we've been doing for a while on trying to understand the agricultural impacts to air quality, particularly in national parks, as well as other rural lands. And I talked about this last year. we had some very confusing results. Turns out the models had errors. We got through it. We pushed forward. I thought I was going to have some great things to show, and we hit more roadblocks. So I'm going to be talking instead about the spatial patterns of ammonia dry deposition velocities derived from CMAC and CAMEX chemical transport models. But first, the disclaimer. All opinions expressed are well-reasoned and insightful. Needless to say, they are not those of the National Park Service, Colorado State University, EPA, or lackeys. Anyone who says otherwise is itching for a fight. I've been waiting for 30 years. I've been waiting to use this disclaimer. Had to wait till I got to come to Madison. So. Objectives. Really, the objectives now are trying to figure out how can we use these models. How can we use these models to extract useful information, to understand reactive nitrogen deposition, other air quality issues. All right, I'm sorry. I apologize. Let me get that right. Other air quality issues on a national scale. I'm going to have to hold this. So here's a real, the motivation and background slide. It's already been said, it's well known. Regulatory regulations have been very effective. We've had economic shifts, changes in fuel prices, and the Sierra Club has resulted in large decreases in emissions, precursors to air pollution. So we've seen a lot of decreases in NOx. We haven't seen those decreases in ammonia emissions. In fact, they may have gone up, if anything. And so we've seen a shift in the atmospheric chemistry from an oxidized-rich environment to a more reduced-rich environment. And that can be seen here from these results from Lee et al. And we're looking at 2011-13 here, but it's true and more true today about the large contribution of the reduced, the ammonium, to the reactive nitrogen deposition versus the oxidized here in red. And this is derived from CASNet, NADP, AMON data. So we had direct measurements of wet deposition, and then we inferred dry deposition. And I want you to take a nice look at, I don't know what color that is, aqua? That's our dry deposition of ammonia, and we are talking about 25 to 70%. So just think about 40% of what we're seeing in the country is dry ammonia. That's going to become important. Okay, so we're modeling. None of this matters except that in CAMEX, oh yeah, we're looking at 2016. That wasn't as old when we started. So the deposition scheme is Zhang, and we're using unidirectional. However, we do have direct fertilizer emissions in this. Our standard emissions, the real key point here is that, at least in the NEI emissions, 85% of those emissions are agricultural related. When we talk about the reduced fraction, we're really talking about ag. In here, mobile sources are probably underestimated, but we just heard that ag is probably underestimated too. So model performance, you know, I should note, I forgot to note, Gustavo Chicara, he's a research scientist at CSU, and he's working directly with us. Most of this work, almost all of this work is his. And he has done a tremendous amount of performance evaluation. I'm going to just show a couple things here. One is what we're looking at here is that every dot is a site, and it's an average value. So here we have the ammonia, nitric acid, wet deposited ammonium, wet deposited nitrate. And if we take a look at the ammonia, it's actually, okay, there's scatter. But, you know, it's along the one-to-one line, and we're just a little bit high. The model's a little bit high. Okay, we take a look at the wet deposition, and geez, it's actually a much tighter correlation. and it's a little bit low. It's on that order of 15% low. It's low, but not bad. The nitrate's terrible. We have real high nitric acid, ambient, real low wet deposited nitrate, but these biases could actually offset. So if we look at a total deposition, it may not be bad, okay? But the key here, the important part for our discussions is the fact that the ammonium is doing well in CAMX. That suggests, contrary to what we heard this morning, that those emissions are good, okay? So then we looked at the oxidized and reduced fractions. So if we look in the northern part of the country, we're seeing that more than 50% of that modeled reactive nitrogen deposition is reduced. That kind of makes sense. As we move to the southern part, we start talking about less than 40%. This seems a little bit odd. Now if we take a look at the dry fraction of reduced, and that's really dry ammonia, we're only talking about 10%, right? I asked you to remember 40%. If we compare that to what we're seeing from the data and inferred dry deposition, we can see that we have a significant imbalance relative to these data for the ammonium, reduced nitrogen. And in fact, we're way underestimating, at least relative to this work, and that's John Walker, I trust John, and Lee. So in this work, it's suggesting that the model is at least a factor of 3, 4 low for the dry deposition. So that has some real implications from if we're trying to do source apportionment, is ag the most important thing, or is it, it's okay. It's part of the problem. And so we wanted to understand this dry deposition, so we created effective deposition velocities, and that's, you take the ratio of those depositions that Colleen, Lily showed, and you divide it by the concentration, okay? So that's essentially a deposition velocity converted to centimeters per second, and in fact, at least for the CAMX model, we compared it to actual deposition velocities coming out of the model. They're essentially the same, okay? And what we're seeing now here is that we're seeing deposition velocities of about 0.5 to 0.1 centimeters per second. Yeah, it gets a little higher. It reaches near 1 in the mountains. Well, what you didn't see in the previous presentations, or you did, but it was hidden, is that the measured deposition velocities tend to be greater than 1. I mean, I know we got this bidirectional thing, but if you average that up and you look at the effectiveness, the effective velocities, tend to be greater than 1, and often greater than on the order of 2 or 3. You know, places like the desert with its alkaline soils, that might not be true. But it's suggesting that we have a real problem in the CAMX model. So Gustavo, very good modeler, he fired up CMAC, and so we ran that using the same inputs, but now we were using the M3 dry mechanisms with a bidirectional ammonia. And this is the same comparison I showed, but for the CMAC, now we're underestimating ammonia, ambient ammonia by 20%. We're underestimating the wet deposition by 50%, but boy, does nitrate look pretty good. And just to compare this so that CAMX actually did a good job on ambient wet deposition, CMAC, good correlations, or similar correlations, but it's a significant underestimation. So what's going on there? If we take a look at these deposition velocities, you saw this map. Now this is the map from CAMX. We see, well, one, of dramatic spatial difference, right? High in the plain state, low in the eastern United States, lower in the west. Here we saw this big north-south gradient, kind of what you'd think temperature-driven. We also see, if you take a look at the magnitudes, there's a factor of 3 or 4 difference here. So this is suggesting that the CMAC has much higher dry deposition. And we can see that here. This is a similar plot, but with CMAC. Here, if we start taking a look at this dry deposition, now it's 40% here in Joshua Tree. We're talking about 20%, 16% in Florida. But remember that big bias in the wet deposition? What's happened here is that our contribution from the wet deposition side is low, and it's low almost by 50%. And so the overall budget between these two models is similar, but we seem to have now a different bias. And that is that we have significantly underestimated the wet deposition as evidenced by data. So this isn't very useful results. I mean, this can give us some very skewed views of the apportionment. And that's just the CAMEX to give you a sense of some of these differences. And that's another way of looking at it. So we can see that CMAQ has a much higher relative contribution of dry ammonia to total reduced nitrogen deposition. It's about a factor of 4. And we can see that the relative contribution of the reduced to the total is the same using these two very different models. Yeah, I have to show this because Greg Beachley, Colleen, John, when we started to get into this, we had to contact people that knew something. And one of the things Greg gave us was the TDEP model results. And so that is a CMAQ run using the equates deposition method with the emission potentials zeroed out, meaning there's no bidirectional flux. And I want to show this because here's another set of deposition velocities that are almost inverted to the M3 drive bidirectional. High in the east, low in the Great Plains, lower in the west. And so this has just created some additional confusion as to what are the models that we can use to trust and to investigate these questions. So, you know, so in summary, we've got this CAMEX model that we can reproduce the ambient concentration, suggesting the ambient emissions could be good. On the other hand, the dry deposition is very low. If we use CMAQ, our dry deposition increases considerably, but now we significantly underestimate our ambient concentrations in wet deposition, indicating the emissions are too low. So we don't, from our analysis, we don't have a good sense. I don't have a definitive way of saying what's right, what's wrong, and what needs to be done. BH, he's provided some insights here. But really what we need is that we need additional constraints on the models. And these additional constraints need to, wow, it's fast. These additional constraints need to be direct, this is my well-reasoned and insightful opinion, they need to be direct measurements of the dry deposition of ammonia. That is the key piece here that we need to be able to constrain these models, constrain these various dry deposition mechanisms so that we can tell us if the emissions are wrong. Because right now, based upon these model results, we have a fundamentally different perspective of the importance of ag, the importance of reduced nitrogen in the southern part of the country compared to the measured data and some of the analyses previously done. And so with that, I can take any questions.
Brett, first of all, I trust you too. So we trust each other. Like we've established that. I just wanted to make a comment that part of what we're seeing here is the wide difference in parameterizing these air surface exchange models and their application. So we have CAMEX. The underlying framework there is different than either of the two schemes in CMAQ. So there's M3 dry, that's different from the TDEP maps, which use the equates stage framework. The emission potentials are different. The cuticular resistances are different. So part of what could be done here is just a more, an analysis of the different models, holding some things the same so that we can pick out, where are the processes deviating from each other the strongest. So I just wanted to add that underlying this very nice analysis are some big differences in not just the air surface exchange frameworks, but how they're being implemented and additional constraints that are being put on them, like zeroing out the compensation points, for example.
Thanks for that, and I recognize that, or we recognize that, and that's what's driving a lot of these differences. But, we're not modelers, we're not dry deposition modelers. We want to be able to use these to address some policy-relevant issues. And so, my question to you guys that know something, which one is closer to the truth?
I'm going to pass the microphone at this point.
I would say the CMAC agrees very well with lichen elemental analysis, which we have calibrated to through-fall deposition to show that it's very good. You can calculate through-fall deposition using lichen total nitrogen, and I have maps of the entire Northwest based on lichen nitrogen deposition that I'd be glad to share with you as maybe part of a data set that could be used for ground truthing, because it all has been converted through our calibration equation to an actual nitrogen deposition value, so we could play with that.
Well, I'd be very interested in that data, and that might be the information we need to constrain this. But my initial response, based upon what we have here, is that CMAC might be getting dry deposition right, but that means it's getting the emissions are significantly underestimated, which affects both the wet and the dry deposition. So the ultimate results that we're getting from CMAC may not be as valuable. This is my perspective. May not be as valuable as they could and should be. So I mean, this is, to me, we have a real important question here. And there's a lot of people that are publishing model results right now. And I get a lot of pressure from our modelers, just publish the damn thing. It's a run, it's information, but it's not, I don't think it's usable information. This is me speaking. Gustavo will disagree, same with Mike. I don't think it's usable information, and I don't want to put misleading information out there.
Thanks for this nice talk. You have like a mini Acme going with the CAMAX and CMAC comparison. So I was wondering, so your last response makes me think maybe the answer is you shouldn't take this there, but I was wondering if you have any initial thoughts on the implications of the difference in partitioning that you're seeing between ammonia and ammonium for the source apportionment questions that you raised. Like perhaps there's longer range transport, right, implied if it's an aerosol form, for example?
Absolutely. If you shift it to much more dry deposition from wet deposition, you're going to change the transport and the deposition patterns. We haven't even tried to investigate that. I'm just trying to get from a global mass balance perspective, does it make sense? And right now, at least regionally, more in that southern part of the country, it doesn't look like it does, to me.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.